She clutched her stomach, her vision blurring as the bustling city streets spun around her. The weight of exhaustion, hunger, and heartbreak pressed down like an unbearable force. Once, she had everything: a luxurious home, the perfect marriage, and a future that seemed untouchable. But that was before the betrayal, before the divorce that left her with nothing, except the life growing inside her. People rushed past, too busy to notice the woman on the brink of collapse. Her breathing grew shallow, her legs trembling beneath her. Just as the world was about to fade to black, a firm but gentle grip caught her. A stranger! A man whose eyes held something unfamiliar concern. "Are you okay?" His voice was deep, steady. She tried to respond, but the pain was too much. Before she could stop herself, everything went dark. Little did she know, this moment would change everything. Warmth. That was the first thing she felt when she stirred awake. A soft pillow beneath her head, the faint scent of clean linen in the air. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was, what had happened. Then it all came crashing back: the dizziness, the pain, the stranger who had caught her before everything went dark. Her fingers curled against the blanket as she tried to sit up, her body still weak. A voice broke the silence. "You're awake!" She turned her head and found him standing near the window, his arms crossed. The man who had saved her. In the daylight, she could finally see him clearly: tall, sharp features, an air of quiet authority. He didn't look like someone who usually stopped to help strangers. "You passed out on the street," he continued. "I brought you here." Her heart pounded. "Here?" She glanced around the spacious but unfamiliar room. It wasn't a hospital, nor was it some cheap motel. The furniture was elegant but not ostentatious, the kind of understated luxury that spoke of wealth without the need to flaunt it. She swallowed hard. "Why?" He studied her as if debating how much to say. "You were in trouble." No one else was stopping to help. It should have been a simple answer, but something in the way he said it made her wary. People like him, men with that kind of presence, that kind of control, didn't usually do things out of sheer kindness. There was always a reason. "I should go," she said, trying to swing her legs over the edge of the bed. But the moment she moved, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen, forcing her to clutch her stomach with a wince. "You're not in any condition to leave." His voice was firm. She hated how weak she must have looked, how helpless. It had been months since she had walked away from her old life, determined to prove she didn't need anyone. But here she was, reliant on a stranger's kindness. "Do you need to go somewhere?" he asked after a moment. She hesitated. Where would she go? The tiny apartment she had scraped together enough money to rent? The place barely had heat, let alone the comfort she needed right now. "No," she admitted, her voice quieter this time. His eyes flickered to her stomach, and she instinctively pulled the blanket up, as if that could hide the truth. She didn't know why, but she didn't want him to ask about it. "Not yet." A long silence stretched between them. "Get some rest," he finally said, turning away. "I'll have food brought up." And just like that, he was gone. She exhaled slowly, unsure whether she should feel relieved or even more on edge. Days passed, and to her surprise, he didn't demand anything from her. He was distant, yet oddly considerate, making sure she had everything she needed, ensuring she ate, even arranging for a doctor to check on her. He never pried, never asked for details she wasn't willing to give. But the silence between them carried weight, like an unanswered question lingering in the air. One evening, as she sat near the window, watching the city lights blink against the dark sky, she finally asked, "Why did you help me?" He was seated across the room, his expression unreadable. "I told you. You needed help. You don't seem like the type to stop for a stranger." Something flickered in his eyes, but it was gone before she could place it. "Maybe you reminded me of someone." It wasn't an answer. Not really, but she could tell he wasn't going to elaborate. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than what he let on. He wasn't just some wealthy man with a guilty conscience. There was something in his gaze, something haunted. She knew better than to pry. After all, She had her own secrets to keep. But secrets had a way of surfacing when least expected. One afternoon, she woke from a nap to hushed voices outside the door. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but something about the conversation made her stomach tighten. "You don't even know who she is," a deep voice said. "I know enough." "It was him." "Do you?" The other man pressed. "Because if you're not careful, this could blow up in your face." "Do you have any idea who her ex-husband is?" She felt the blood drain from her face. "That doesn't matter," he said, his tone controlled, but there was an edge to it now. There was a pause. Then the other man scoffed. "You always think you can fix everything, don't you? Just be careful. Some people don't like loose ends." Footsteps faded down the hall, and for a long time she sat frozen in place. So he knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to know who she had been before she became just another nameless woman struggling to survive. And if he knew, then so did they. Her pulse pounded. She had been careful, had made sure there was no way for her past to catch up with her. But if someone had found out where she was, she couldn't stay. Pushing past the nausea, she forced herself out of bed and reached for the bag she had barely touched since arriving. Her hands shook as she stuffed what little she had inside. She didn't know where she would go, only that she had to disappear before it was too late. But when she reached the door, it was already open. He stood there, watching her. "You heard," he said, his voice quiet. She gripped the strap of her bag. "I can't stay here. You think running will fix this?" "I don't have a choice." He stepped forward, blocking her path. "You do." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. Not a threat. Not a demand. Just certainty. She shook her head. "You don't understand." "I do." His voice was firm now. "More than you think." For the first time since she met him, she saw something raw in his expression. A flicker of pain. Recognition. As if he knew exactly what it felt like to have everything ripped away. She didn't want to believe him. She couldn't. Because if she did, then she'd have to admit she wasn't as alone as she thought. She stood there, frozen in place, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. Everything in her screamed to run, to disappear before it was too late. She had done it before, left behind everything, erased herself from the life she once knew. But this time felt different. This time, someone was standing in her way, not as an enemy, but as someone who refused to let her carry the burden alone. His eyes held steady, unwavering. "I know what you're afraid of," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I know you think running is your only option. But you don't have to do this alone." A bitter laugh nearly escaped her. "You don't understand." "I do," he cut in, his voice sharp with something that sounded dangerously close to emotion. "I know what it's like to have your life ripped away, to have people take from you until you're nothing but a ghost of who you used to be." His jaw tightened. "And I know that no matter how far you run, the past finds you." She swallowed, her throat dry. "Then what do you expect me to do?" He exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. "Stay. Let me help." The words sent a shiver down her spine, not because they scared her, but because for the first time in so long, they made her want to believe in something again. But believing in someone had cost her everything before. She shook her head. "I can't drag you into this." "You're not dragging me into anything." I stepped in willingly. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. She had spent so long being on her own, trusting no one, expecting nothing. And yet, here he was, offering her something she had almost forgotten how to accept: help. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, gently easing the bag from her grip. "Just give it one day," he said. "One day to see if we can figure this out together." She hesitated, her heart pounding. "One day." That was all. Slowly, she nodded. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake in the unfamiliar room, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Had she just made the worst mistake of her life? Or was this the first time she was finally making the right choice? The next morning, she found him waiting for her in the study. He had already made calls, already put things in motion. "I have people looking into your ex-husband's movements," he said without preamble. "We need to know if he's looking for you." The words sent a chill down her spine. She had done everything she could to stay off the radar. Changed her name, cut ties, disappeared. But men like her, ex-powerful, ruthless, never truly let go. "You think he already knows where I am?" she asked, her voice quieter now. His expression darkened. "I think someone wants him to." Her stomach twisted. "You mean someone told him?" "It's possible." He leaned forward, his gaze locked onto hers. "Do you have any idea who would want to betray you?" She let out a hollow laugh. "Take your pick." There had been so many. The moment her marriage fell apart, people who once smiled in her face had turned cold, their loyalty shifting with the tides of power. She had been a liability, an inconvenience. And when she walked away, no one had followed. But someone had been watching. "I need you to think," he pressed. "Anyone who knew where you were before you came here." She closed her eyes, trying to piece together the past few months. She had been so careful, so sure that no one had been paying attention. But there was one person. Her pulse spiked. "There was a woman," she said suddenly, "at the shelter I stayed in before I found my apartment." He frowned. "A woman?" She nodded. "She was friendly. Too friendly. Kept asking me questions, trying to get me to talk about my past. I never told her anything, but..." She swallowed. "She must have figured it out." His jaw tightened. "Do you remember her name?" She did. And when she said it, something in his expression shifted. "You know her," she realized. He didn't deny it. "Not personally. But if she's involved, your ex-husband isn't far behind." A sharp wave of nausea rolled through her. "Then I have to go," she whispered. "No," he said immediately. She shook her head, panic setting in. "You don't understand. If he finds me..." "He won't," he cut in, his voice like steel. "Because I won't let him." Her breath caught. He said it so simply, as if it was a fact rather than a promise. As if he truly believed he could stand against a man like her, ex, and win. She wanted to believe him. But she had spent too long learning that no one could stand against power and come out unscathed. And yet, for the first time in forever, she wasn't alone. The next few days passed in a blur. She stayed in the house, watched as he worked behind the scenes, pulling strings, making calls. He had resources, connections that stretched far beyond anything she could have imagined. He wasn't just some wealthy man who had stopped to help a stranger. He was someone who knew how to fight in a world where the rules didn't apply to people like them. And slowly she began to understand. She wasn't the only one running from ghosts. One evening, she found him in the study, staring at an old photograph. When she stepped closer, she saw the pain etched in his face. "Who was she?" she asked softly. His fingers tightened around the edges of the photo. "Someone I couldn't save." The weight of his words settled between them. She didn't ask for more, because she knew what it was like to carry the weight of the past. The night her ex-husband's men finally came, she was ready. But she wasn't alone. And when she stood in the aftermath, breathing hard, staring at the man who had once sworn she would never escape him, she realized something. She had won. Not just because she had fought back, but because for the first time, she had chosen to trust. And that had made all the difference.